So welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Welcome to the virtual reading group. Today we are continuing at the very beginning, but continuing to read Hannah Arendt's book, The Human Condition. As we talked about last week, it's also called in German, and this was her original title that the American publishers didn't like, the Vita Activa. Vita Activa and the Human Condition are not the same thing, and yet they're obviously connected. So last week, we read the prologue, and we got to hear some David Bowie, and I apologize for those who were expecting more music this week, but I don't have any music planned. We're reading chapter 1, and let me just say something about the structure of the book and how to talk about it. I mean, this seems basic, but I've been teaching this book for 20 years, and I still can't decide how to call the chapters. So if you'll notice in the book has a number of chapters. I think the 6 chapters, but it has 41 sections, or 40, no, more than that. I'm sorry. 44 sections, 45. Sorry, 45 sections. And those sections I sometimes find myself calling chapters, and yet then what do you call the longer things, which are what she calls chapters. So I'm going to try my best to create some sort of clarity, so those of you know where I am. The chapters are the 6 chapters: the human condition, private and public, labor, work, action, and then vita activa and the modern age. And then the sections are within each chapter. So today we're reading chapter 1, the human condition. And then there's 3 parts of that. One is called Vita Activa and the Human Condition, which really lays out, in some sense, part of the topic of the book. What is the Vita Activa and the Human Condition? The 2 titles she ends up using for the book. The second part is about the term Vita Activa itself, a term that is not self-explanatory and is confusing, I think, for many of us. And then the third section is eternity versus immortality, a theme, eternity versus immortality, which I think is absolutely central to the book and all of Arendt's writing, and yet one that, for reasons we'll go into, I think is largely ignored or underemphasized by people reading Arendt. So let me talk a little bit about these 3 sections within chapter 1. So chapter 1 is, as I said, on Vita Activa and the human condition. What does she mean? Well, she begins by saying that the word Vita Activa refers to 3 fundamental activities of what it means to be human. These 3 fundamental activities are going to be labor, in German arbeiten, which we often translate as work, but she's going to make a distinction here. So labor, and then and then in English, work, and then action. In German, it's Arbeit, herstellen und Tätigkeit. Handeln. So we'll have to, as we get into those sections, the chapters on labor, work, and action, we'll have much more to say about it. But for now, and I think it's just important to understand, she wants to say that each of these 3 is a fundamental activity of human life, and that each corresponds itself to fundamental conditions under which life on earth has been given to man. Now, this is the first paragraph. She says, they are fundamental because each corresponds to one of the basic conditions under which life on earth has been given to man. So in that sentence, I want to focus you on three things. One is each one corresponds to the basic conditions. What are these basic conditions? Well, she's going to argue that the basic conditions of labor that corresponds to labor is life, is to be alive. Labor is about working. I'm sorry, got to be careful. Labor is about laboring in order to produce those things that are necessary for us to live: food, housing, shelter, and anything else that we need to live. And thus labor is connected to the life cycle, the life process for Hannah Arendt. And because what labor makes is not is something that we need for living, it doesn't last. We consume it, we eat it, or we use it, and it has a use value. And as something that has a use value, we then consume it. And so whether it's bread, or whether it's a pencil that eventually, you work down to the nub, or whether it's a computer that you use for increasingly shorter amounts of time before you throw it out and get a new one, labor is what makes these things that we consume. And thus, she calls it worldless. So one aspect of labor is that it's worldless. The basic conditions of labor is life. Of basic condition of work is worldliness. Namely that whereas labor makes things that we consume and thus disappear, work produces things, brings them forth that last. And thus it provides an artificial world of things that last beyond a human life, that transcend all individual life. And thus the human condition of work is its worldliness, because these things that we produce through work are now part of the world. They're part of the world we share with each other. And thus the artwork, which is a work that has no utilitarian value, or should have, in Arendt's view, no utilitarian value, is the quintessential object of work, because we produce it, it enters the world, and it lasts. It's whether it's in a museum or as a building or as a story, and it becomes part of the world that we all share. And then the third basic condition that we here are talking about is plurality, which is the condition that underlies political action or action. And so insofar as action is the starting of something new, it's the speaking and doing of things in public in such a way that your speech and actions are spontaneous. They're not expected. They're free, right? This is her idea of freedom. They're new and unpredictable and shocking. And insofar as you speak and act in ways that are shocking and new, what's going to happen? People are going to talk about it. They're going to come around and look at you and say, that's strange, that's new. And as they do so, they'll start talking about you. And as they start talking about you, they start creating memories and histories and stories that unite us as a people. And so this is only possible if we're all unique and different, because then we can create new things that surprise people. And so plurality is the condition of action. So in this first sentence, or the second sentence of the book, they are fundamental, right? These labor, work, and action, because each corresponds to a basic condition, right? So those are the three basic conditions: life for labor, worldliness for work, and plurality for action. But the second thing she says in that sentence is they're the basic conditions under which life on Earth. And here we just want to be clear about life on Earth. We talked a little bit about this last week as we discussed the prologue, where she says that Earth is the quintessence of the human condition. But the point here is that these basic activities, labor, work, and action, and the basic conditions, plurality, worldliness, and life, apply to life on Earth. Now you think, well, why do we need to distinguish that? Because a large part of this book is going to be about raising the question of what happens to human life, to the human condition, when we leave the Earth. Now, that can be a literal question, as it was in the prologue, where she says that the one of the two great events of the modern world is the launch of Sputnik, which signifies our desire to leave the Earth, our desire to be non-earthly, and much of this book is going to be about how the modern age, which she says starts with the scientific revolution and goes forward, is very much about an attack on our earthliness. And so the fundamental conditions of being human, labor, work, and action, are not only the activities of labor, work, and action not only have the conditions of life, worldliness, and plurality, but they are connected to life on Earth. And part of our inquiry is going to be about what happens when we become alienated from the Earth, as well as alienated from the world. And then the third is that these have been given to man, that these, which on life on Earth, has been given to man, given in the sense of fated, that we are born into a world. And so part of the idea is that we humans are born into a world that precedes us, and we have to live on it. But we're also these crazy creatures, we humans, insofar as we're not only born into a world, but we can remake that world, right? That's part of our creative human power. And insofar as we can remake that world, we create a world that then our own creations become the new home in which we're born into. So the world we're born into in the 21st century is not the same world that people in the 18th century or people in the 10th century or people in the Greeks or back in the Hebrews or the Zoroastrians or whoever were born into. And so part of what she's talking about here is labor, work, and action are these basic activities that correspond to basic conditions, life, worldliness, and plurality, that were given to life on Earth, which we may be losing as we become universal and not earthly beings, as has been given to man, but we may be changing the conditions under which we live because we no longer live in an Earth simply given to man, but one that we also constantly are creating and recreating. And so this brings us to an important, I think, well-known but important distinction that Arendt makes in this opening section of the first chapter, which is that there's a difference between human nature and the human condition. This book is not about human nature, right? It's not about what humans are in some sort of abstract sense. She's not going to get into that debate. And on page 8, she has a long footnote where she explains that I'm sorry, on page 10, she has a long footnote where she explains that, this is not a question that humans can understand. Only God, if he could, or if she could, or if they could, can understand the essence of what humans are. We're really concerned not with that essence, but with the conditions. And her point is that being born onto the earth creates certain conditions for human life. Over time, those conditions change. And so one of the things we have to ask ourselves is, how are they changing? And specifically, as we live in a world increasingly governed by science, where we increasingly think from a universal and not an earthly perspective, what does it mean to being human, to live in a world in which the conditionality of being human, the way we're conditioned, is no longer essentially by earthliness, and is constantly being changed by our increasingly fast-paced ability to recondition the world, to make it anew. Again, spoiler alert, right? The last chapter of the book is going to concern what it would mean for man to live in a fully artificial world, right? One like a spaceship. I mean, imagine that we were to build a spaceship and be born on it and die on it, so that everything we encounter, including the humans, which we, through genetic modification or artificial insemination or cloning or whatever it is, made customized so that they would live well in this environment in a spaceship, so that everything we encountered was not natural, not earthly, not fated, but in some sense humanly made. How would that change what it means to be human? And that's a big part of this book. Section 2 of chapter 1, right, which is on the vita activa, the term the vita activa, is simply somewhat of a terminological chapter, and yet clearly much more than that. She makes two distinctions, right? So one is the move from what she calls the bios politikos, which is the Aristotelian term for the life of the political man, to the vita activa. And in that sense, she just wants us to understand that there's a slight difference. The bios politikos from Aristotle is one of three ways to live freely as a human being. You can concern yourself with consuming beautiful things, you can concern yourself with thinking about beautiful things, or you can consume yourself with living a life of excellent deeds in the polis. These are three ways that Aristotle thought you could live freely. And the bios politikos was the one in the middle, that you would concern yourself with the world of the polis. The vita activa is a medieval translation of the bios politikos, but it's broader than that. It's not just limited to the political life. It concerns all kinds of active engagement with the life. And thus, it really is seen as opposed to the vita contemplativa, which was one of the active ways of life that Aristotle had understood. So that's the change. And so Arendt includes labor and work, Arbeit and Herstellen, along with action in the vita activa. So, okay, that's the term. Why does she call this book the vita activa, right? At least in German, because a big part of this book is about the fact that in the modern age, beginning with the scientific revolution, a massive transformation happened in which the Western tradition, the Western tradition of political thinking, which begins with Plato and in her mind ends with Marx, one of the things it did is it devalued the world on earth. It devalued politics. It devalued all active life. Plato, as you'll remember, right, elevated the ideas over the sort of dark shadows of the cave and said that we have to step out of the cave into the light of ideas, and then the philosopher has to come back in and rule the world down under from the perspective of truth seen through the light of ideas. And this disdain for the dark life of earth and the elevation of the life of ideas over the life of the world, for Arendt is a constant in the Western political tradition. And so for the whole period of that time, you have basically a diminishment of the active life. With the rise of the scientific revolution, we have a reversal. Now, the vita activa comes to be more important and dominant again. The life of contemplation, which really attains its full dominance under Christianity, where we care more about the life above than the life below. Suddenly, after the Enlightenment and through the age of science, contemplation is denigrated, and the vita activa is raised up. But it's not simply that the whole vita activa is raised up. What the key that Arendt is going to talk about in the book is that the vita activa was never fully, because it was always a negative, it was seen as the opposite of the vita contemplativa. It was seen as sort of the low end of what was good, which was to think about ideas and truth. People didn't spend that much time on it. And they didn't make that much of a distinction between labor, work, and action. They just sort of bunched it all together. And what she says is, we need to look at this vita activa much more closely than we've ever looked at it before, because it's not just one thing. It's many things. It's labor, work, and action, and thinking and others, but it's at least those three. And what she says is that it used to be, right, that labor and work were seen as lower and action was seen as higher within the vita activa, which altogether was seen as lower than the vita contemplativa. But now that vita activa has become the dominant way of human life, we need to understand that another transformation has happened, which is that labor and work are not only now not lower than action, but labor has actually become the dominant aspect of the vita activa. And in doing so, since the basic condition of labor is life, as I said before, and consumption, life and consumption become the dominant directing ideals and motives of the modern world, as opposed to simply the modern age. And in many ways, that is what this book is about. It is about how under the impact of the modern age, namely the rise of science, the vita activa replaces the vita contemplativa, and within the vita activa, there's another replacement, whereas labor replaces action as the dominant human activity, and thus life replaces plurality as the dominant human condition. You can hear this, right, in the dominance today of human rights as a discourse and way of thinking. Samuel Moyn has written a wonderful book called The Last Utopia about human rights. And what he argues is all the other ideologies, whether it's communism or Christianity or other values, have increasingly lost their ability to sway people. And what we have left is human rights. What Arendt adds to Moyne's reading, right, is that the reason human rights has become the least common denominator, the thing we can all agree on when we can't agree on justice, whether it's communist or capitalist, or whether it's nationalist or internationalist, we can't agree on those. The one thing we can all agree on is human rights. And what she understands is that the reason we can agree on human rights is because it's about life. And life is the last high value we understand. This leads us into the third section of this first chapter on the human condition, eternity versus immortality. Now, remember, what we've just said is that this book is about the vita activa, or the human condition, about how the concern with life and labor and life and consumption becomes the highest concern of the human condition. And what she now does is she says, we need to actually look back at this old distinction between eternity and immortality. Immortality, right, which she sees as a concept that has its origin in the Greeks. Immortality is a trusted persistence and endurance in time. Its basic idea is that the humans are mortal and everything else is immortal. That seems strange to you, but it's true for her. It's true for the Greeks, at least. The gods are immortal because they don't die and they are always there. They're part of the world. The world is immortal. The cosmos is immortal because it's never changing. It's there. The stars, the firmament, right? This isn't a scientific idea. It's how people see them as immortal. And even animals and species life are immortal because they reproduce and they're always ants. And we don't think of ants. We don't say George over here and Sally over here. And, because they're ants, we don't individualize them. So when one ant dies and another one replaces it, we think of them as immortal, as living in a cycle. Humans are the only mortal creatures. And so within this idea of mortality and immortality, humans have a very particular telos, or end, in the world. And so on page 19, Arendt announces sort of what it was to be human in a world of immortality, which is that, quote, the task and potential greatness of mortals lie in their ability to produce things, works, deeds, and words, which would deserve to be, and at least to a degree are, at home in everlastingness, so that through them mortals could find their place in a cosmos where everything is immortal except themselves. So in a world of immortality, humans are have a task, which is to do great things, to do things, words, deeds, and actions, and speech that are remembered. And she says on page 19, I think, one of the most provocative and for many people disturbing lines in all of Arendt's work, and trust me, there are a lot of provocative and disturbing lines in all of Arendt's work. But she says on page 19, the distinction between man and animal runs right through the human species itself. Only the best, aristoi, who constantly prove themselves to be the best, aristoien, and who prefer immortal fame to mortal things, are really human. The others, content with whatever pleasures nature will yield them, live and die like animals. Now, she says this is the opinion of Heraclitus, right? And, one can wonder exactly to what extent it's her opinion. But clearly for her, this old idea of immortality means that what it means to be a human, as opposed to an ant or a dog or a star or a god, is to strive to be immortal, to strive to do things that are immortal, to make not, and that could be to die, right? Dying is, everyone was going to die, but if you die doing a great deed, you live immortally in people's memory. If you die in a battle and it's recorded, you become immortal. And so the point is that in the world of immortality, it's not life that matters, but your impact on the world, your courage to put the world above your life. And that to her is the first virtue of politics, courage, to care more about the world than about your life. Against this idea of immortality is the Socratic idea and the Platonic idea of eternity, which is lasting forever, but in a universal sense, not in a worldly sense. So gods that don't have human form, the Judeo-Christian gods as a main example, are founded in eternity, not in immortality. And Socrates, who never wrote down his thoughts, didn't care about the worldliness of his thoughts. It was more about a kind of eternal truth. Plato and Aristotle both sought unspeakable truths, or truth without words. And she calls these experiences, quote, outside the plurality of men, on page 18. There, and in the search for eternity as opposed to immortality, there's a kind of political death that emerges. And so this eternal is connected with the vita contemplativa and is outside of the vita activa. The point for Arendt, and the reason this strange chapter is here in chapter 1, the strange section on immortality and eternity, is that the victory of the eternal over the immortal, right, throughout from Plato and Aristotle up through the end of Christianity, the end of the Enlightenment, up until the 17th, 18th century, is that the eternal is victorious over the immortal, and we split contemplation from action, and we raise contemplation, in which we contemplate the eternal, over action. Now, as we enter this modern world after the break of this tradition, action, vita activa, is now asserting itself above the vita contemplativa. But even as that's happening, she says, we are not returning to a striving for immortality, right? We're not resurrecting the value of immortality. And so what we have is a return of action, vita activa, but without a goal of immortality, the task and greatness of mortals, which she says on page 21, right? The last line of this introduction, she says that this striving for immortality had been the spring and center of the vita activa. What made the vita activa spring, what gave it its center, what made it alive, or not alive, that's the wrong word, what made it meaningful, was that people in the active world, the dark world, the world of shadows for Plato, strove to reach into the eternal, into the immortal, strove to do things that would be great, that would bring glory onto the world, to make the world worthy of human habitation. Well, now, when the vita activa is finally victorious, in the modern world, we've lost our the spring and center of it, which is this will for immortality. And without that will for immortality, all the vita activa cares about is staying alive, right? We're back to life. We've lost the concern with worldliness and plurality, which is the dignity of the vita activa for Arendt, and all we have is keeping ourselves alive. Okay. that's a quick and dirty, I hope, but hopefully somewhat helpful reading of the first chapter of this book on the human condition. And I think what I want just to focus on is it's about the rise of the vita activa, but the hollowing out of the vita activa, so that the vita activa is, first of all, most about labor and not about work and action. And that's connected to the loss of immortality as the spring and center. And so one of the things you have to struggle with if you're reading Arendt, right? You have to struggle. I think you have to struggle as an Arendtian with this sentence that none of us like, or most of us don't like, that the distinction between man and animal runs right through the human species itself. Only the best, who constantly prove themselves to be the best, are really human. She's not saying, let me just say this, I'm positive, but I don't think she's saying that there are higher and lower humans. I don't think that's what she's saying at all. We can have that argument if you want, but what she is saying is that to fulfill the task of your humanity, you have to strive not just to live, but to have the courage to insert yourself into the world and engage in political speech and action or work that acknowledges that the world is more important than your individual life. That's part of what it means to be human for her. And in doing that, you're having the courage to live as a human and not as simply an animal that has a kind of species life. And what this book is about the way in which the loss of immortality and the rise of science together strip that dignity of what it means to be human, to strive for immortality and to strive to act. And thus the conditions of plurality and worldliness are lowered while the condition of life and consumption is elevated. Okay, I'll stop there. And I see there's already some hands up. I'm going to mute everyone just so we get it muted. And now, if you'd like to speak when I call on you, you can unmute yourself. James, you once again are first. We'll have to ask people at some point to wait till we're done. But okay, James, go ahead.
Page 15.
Yep.
Thus, every kind of activity, even the processes of mere thought, must culminate in the absolute quiet of contemplation. Every movement, the movements of body and soul, as well as of speech and reasoning, must cease before truth. Truth, be it the ancient truth of being, can reveal itself only in complete human stillness.
Yeah. Right. So here she's talking about this idea of skole, which is a Greek word, one of the two Greek words for leisure, the other one being otium. And what she says is that the philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, and then later the Christians, valued skole. And skole is a kind of leisure, but it's a particular kind of leisure, which is freedom from political activity. And you hear in the word skole our word school or scholar. So schools are places where people go, or used to go, to be free from politics and pursue the truth. Increasingly, schools have been politicized, but that was at least what the tradition of a school was. A scholar, again, is someone who retreats from the world in order to think about what is true. And so in scholarship, there should be a kind of quiet, a kind of silence. If you think back to those Vermeer paintings of the astronomer and others, where they're sitting alone in their room contemplating books and globes and telescopes and things. Um, and so this idea of a scholia, of leisure, was seen as the privilege of the scholar and those who had the money and time to be free from the vita activa, the world of politics or the world of acquisition, um, and could just spend their time thinking about what is true.
Do you think does that still work?
Well,
It seems like today things are moving so fast, so fast, so fast. Truth, truth is happening in movement.
well, I think this is part of the argument of the book is the vita contemplativa was seen by still seen by Aristotle and seen by the Christians as where truth is. There are still scholars, I know many of them in my world of scholars, who believe that our job is to sit in libraries and take walks along the forest path and contemplate human existence and truth. Um, uh, Increasingly, I'll just use Bard as an example, which is a wonderful school where I'm based and the Arendt Center is based. Increasingly we talk about civic engagement and how to have education that is civically engaged, and what does that mean? There's I think a skepticism among some people, many people, about contemplation. Now, I think there's still an argument that some people make that you need pure science, not governed by utility, because that's where you make these crazy discoveries that then are useful because they can be used in making nanodes and all that stuff. And so, you can actually still, in some fields, justify paying pure scientists to do that kind of science. But the justification for it is not that it's valuable in itself. It's that it will end up leading to discoveries that will be useful in the world. So your skepticism, I think, is well placed. I don't think it's I think increasingly that idea of skole, of freedom from the active world, is seen with suspicion. And today, those who seek to be pure scholars in that sense are, I think, seen suspiciously, even at universities and colleges. This is part of Arendt's argument that uh, um, in our modern age, we've seen a inversion, whereas so that now the vita activa is the seat of value, not the vita contemplativa. Um, Again, that's less important from her point of view than the further inversion within the vita contemplativa of labor over action and work. But that's the argument.
Thank you.
Yep. Jeff, I see.
Yeah,
Wow.
thank you. Okay, so I had two burning questions, and one I'm just going to mention in passing in case someone else wants to pick it up, because Ayala's not here, and it's about the psychotherapeutic angle that the Vita contemplativa appears to have some connection to the death drive. But I'll leave that if we have any other psycho analysis type people around here today that can carry that ball a little further. My other question is, it's kind of similar to James, really. So I just wanted to throw in, I really think we need to grapple with this question of how can we hold up as an ideal for everybody a form of life that's limited, not so much by the type of the person. I agree with you. It's not about that there are different kinds of people, but there are different stations in life. And so, the idea that you've got to have someone to do the grunt work so that you can do the vita activa is really quite a sticking point there. And I think that if there isn't an answer in there to resolve that tension, it's probably to do with plurality. And I think that the plurality that the Greeks referred to was that, okay, there were a bunch of people that had reached a certain station in life, and there were a bunch of them, and so then they had to sort of govern. They had to deal with other people who were their equals. But now we want everybody to be our equals. Will that scale, or what do we do with that? Where can we look? We just need to sort of get that hope a little more in our grasp that this is going to be work, that it's going to pull us together instead of stratifying us.
Right. So a few things. Jeff, there's a lot made for good reasons about Arendt's comments on the fact that the Greek polity depended upon slavery. Again, we'll get to that later in the text. But at this point, what she's saying is that there are three fundamental basic activities that are connected with being human, and they're all important, right? You can't be human. You can't be fully human if you don't act, and if you don't work, and if you don't labor. So, one of the things that she's going to say in the labor section is that those people who had slaves and didn't do any labor, and all they did was think or act, also weren't fully human, right? They were only exercising part of their humanity. Now, she thinks to some degree they were exercising the higher part of their humanity, but still not all part of their humanity. She thinks that part of what it means to be human is to labor, just like it also means to work and to act. The question you're raising is that if we do need to act, how do we act if we are always busy laboring, right? To provide our food, because then we don't have time and we don't have the courage to enter the world and risk our lives for an idea, or spend years creating a book that will become a masterpiece or a poem. And I think that's a fair question. She raises, again, this is a fairly shockingly technological book. In the section in the chapter on labor, which we'll be reading soon, she will raise the question of whether robots can replace manual labor in that way, and have some very interesting things to say about what robots can and can't do in providing our labor for us, and whether they can replace the need for laborers or slaves or things like that. That question will come up. I think there's another way to read your question or hear your question, which is that, not everyone is going to be political and act, and not everyone is going to be an artist or work. And therefore, what she's saying is there are different levels, stations, whatever you want to call it, in life. And the answer is yes. That is part of Arendt's thinking. I don't think she elevates them or prioritizes them in that sense. She certainly doesn't think anyone should have more rights than other because they're more active, or that someone should have more right to healthcare or better housing because they're more active. I don't think that is, in fact, I'm fairly sure that's not her point. It's simply a matter of who's more human, but not in the sense of human that we sometimes think of, that humanity, that someone is dehumanized, doesn't have rights. That's not her point at all. But it's more living up to the ideal of humanity, as at least it's been understood in the human condition, in the way we've been conditioned. A humanity which and a human condition which he thinks is changing and undergoing radical changes, and maybe very different in a few generations than it has been for thousands of years. I don't know if I got I'm not sure if I got the full essence of your question, Jeff, but.
No, you did. I don't want to take up time because so many people waiting. Somebody mentioned organic intellectual in the chat, and that's sort of the direction I feel like we're going to go. This is going to come up a lot, so we don't have to solve it today. I'm
gonna do a little bit of in and out of picking around, just because I don't want it to all be. I'm trying to give a plurality of questioners. Ayala, I saw you raised your hand. I don't know if you were trying to respond to Jeff. Did you want to add something to what Jeff was saying? Because he mentioned
he did, and I asked in the chat actually what for him to expand on this, but because I'm not sure, I wasn't sure what the question was, but my comment is different, and since there were other people in front of me, do you want to let other?
Go ahead.
Okay.
I'll let you jump the queue for a second, because you were mentioned. I'm giving you the mentioned jump.
What an honor. No, really. I don't understand the bipolarity here, the contrast between the active part in us and the contemplative part of us. I mean, all of it, life itself is activa. Life is emotion. Life is constantly activity. That's what it is, compared to inanimate objects. Although there are some opinions about inanimation that also include a movement. So it looks like those two are features, both are features and necessary features of being a human. I had also a problem with the immortality. How important it is to leave the tracks in the sand has to do mostly not with an altruistic thinking about other people or society, but more about the ego. It's an illusion of continued life. But when this immortality is not the focus of man and woman, then one should do exactly what she kind of diminishes, which is live life. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of assumptions that are troubling me, and that immortality has to do with leaving tracks in the sand, or as depicted as altruism or as collective. I understand as that political activism is something that she promotes, and actually I see that also as kind of a responsibility of us as humans. And it should go the best way to live in my perception is to connect the two. The thinking part, the ideas, with how they play in life and how we can apply them.
Thanks, Ayala. So first of all, I think not only me, but I think Arendt would agree with you that you want to apply both thinking and action. The distinction she's making is not hers, right? It's one that comes from Augustine and the Middle Ages, vita activa versus the contemplativa. And it's not supposed to be an absolute distinction. Of course, there's always action in life and activity in life, and there's always contemplation, or can be, not always. I think, one has to ask why she's doing this, right? She's looking at what she's looking at what she thinks the world, the human world, is like. And what she's seeing is that from Plato and Aristotle through the Christians up until some period, in the last 200 or 300 years, there was at least in the tradition of thought, right? There was a real condemnation of worldly action, politics, consumption, and that what you were supposed to do is, pray to God, live a good life, think, be a scholar, be in quiet. And suddenly, that's changing with the rise of science, the Industrial Revolution, and automation. There's an activity to life, and the sort of and even scholars are now Marxists, and thus believe that the point of scholarship is to change the world, not to think about truth. So on the one hand, it's a descriptive project, but she's also suggesting that within the descriptive project of what's happening in these changes are serious changes that are going to impact what it means to be human, and change our highest values. And what she sees is changing not just away from contemplation to action, but again, within action, away from worldly concerns to a sort of a single-minded concern with man as a living being. Now, this brings us to your second question, where you sort of suggest that leaving tracks in the sand is an egoistic act, right? That's I think it's an important point. On the one hand, there's a way in which leaving tracks in the sand is egoistic, in the sense that you want your kids to talk about you, or you want people to talk about you, or you want to leave something that will be talked about. It's egoistic. Her argument, I think, is that people who leave track in the sands don't act egoistically. They act, they're people who are consumed by a desire to put something in the world. They, a need to, whether you're an artist and you spend all these years creating a poem or a work or whatever it is, you're not doing it egoistically, she doesn't think, if you're going to be successful. And if you're a political actor, again, you're risking your life, and you don't think, oh, I'm going to risk my life so that I'll be remembered. That's not, I don't think, usually how it works. You risk your life because you believe you have to do it. And so, I think she sees a concern with immortality as not a sort of egoistic desire to leave tracks, but a valuing of the world. And to the extent that our concern with immortality has become egoistic, it is more about life and preserving ourselves in some sense than it is about the world or plurality. And so if that's the case, then I think in a way that would be her point, is that it's changed. If that's okay. Jason? Did I lose you guys? Suddenly I don't hear anyone.
I'm here.
Okay.
Okay. I'll follow right in on top of that, actually, because you go back to page 19 and she talks about the mortality of men lies in the fact that individual life with a recognizable life story from birth to death rises out of biological life. I was very much looking at the question of, are they, is Arendt giving these immortals a little too much credit um, for their impetus, for what brought them to that? I mean, you could almost talk about, I would question, were they not more concerned about their own mortality? Were they not saying, listen, I am mortal and I fear death? And, can I have some kind of a stratagem to, find some way to push past the veil, that is awaiting us all, the funeral veil in this case? And isn't that another way we could read this? Or are you saying from your previous comment, she anticipates that so much, that there are people who don't, act out of a fear of death, a desire to be
Yeah,
preserved by the tribe?
I think you're making a point very similar to Ayala's, if I understand it, and saying, isn't this egoistic? Um, and you know, I hear that. I think it's a very contemporary way of reading the concern with immortality, but I think it misses what Arendt understands immortality to be. Immortality, she says, is endurance in time, deathless life on this earth and in this world, as it was given. It's to be immortality is when you can't ever determine whether you're going to be immortal, right? If I create a work of art, it doesn't make me immortal. What makes me immortal is when other people celebrate that work of art and talk about it and tell stories about it and preserve it. And if I do a political action, it doesn't make me immortal. It can make me dead, but it could also make me immortal if other people tell the stories about it. And so there's a great risk to the kind of action or work that can lead to immortality. And it takes courage to do it. And Arendt sees it as generally something we won't do simply, because we're not in control of it. You're not going to do it if your main concern is yourself. Obviously that, today I think, and maybe at all times you see people who enter politics because they just want fame or something along those lines. So I'm not going to say it's 100%. I'm not going to say it's a hard, rule or that there aren't people like that. But she doesn't see that as what artists or workers or actors or speakers, what drives them. And she thinks that I think she would think I'd have to see if she ever wrote about it, but I think she would think that those who sought to attain immortality as their main goal will generally not be successful because they're not gonna, they're not acting out of a kind of truth. They're acting out of a egoistic desire, and it's rare that they would actually succeed. I think, I don't have a citation for that in her work, but I sort of imagine that might be a way she'd respond to that. But it's more me than her.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm just because I'm gonna just try and shake it up a little bit, but I'm gonna get to everybody, so don't worry. Inji.
Oh, hi, Roger.
Hi.
That was really good answer. Like how we are dependent on other people when we are working. Just my question is, how do you reconcile caring about the world and worldliness, and caring about the disappearance of the world, and disdain for survivor driven and species life, when the earth is one of the most important conditions where worldliness is based on. So I guess my question is the tension between the will for immortality versus caring about the world where the earth plays an important part. So I guess I just read something about I can send it to you, some decolonial critique on Arendt somebody wrote from Human Geography, and so she was kind of making this critique of the earthly life is also important, and how do we understand the worldliness in a decolonial way. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Inji. So this is a kind of environmental critique too, right? If I'm understanding.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
environment. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so again, part of my reading of Arendt, and again, not to say I'm always right, ever right, is to sort of take out some of the normative bite that I think the critic you're reading sort of ascribes to Arendt. Like, I don't think Arendt is sitting here saying we need to be more earthly or less earthly, right? She says the earth has the quintessence of the human condition. And yet she says we're living through a time in which we want to flee the earth, and we hate the earth, and we want to we want to escape the earth. She doesn't endorse either one of these two views, so far as I know. I mean, someone can tell me I'm wrong. As she says, the effort is to think what we are doing, right, as we do this. So I think there's you could make what I would call a conservationist reading of Arendt, and say, she cares about the earth and she's worried about science, alienating us from the earth. And then you could make a sort of progressive Arendt, which is she sees that the earth is simply a constraint and that science is taking us away from that, and we need to embrace science. I think they're both wrong. I don't think either of those are Arendt. I think Arendt is an attempt to understand and think through our the ways in which we are both tied to the earth, and the ways in which there's a deep human desire and need to escape that tie to the earth. The tie to the earth is not caught up in human nature. So if we were to destroy the earth and we were to create a new planet and all go and live on that, we would still be human from Arendt's point of view. We would have a different condition, and the human condition would be fundamentally different. But there's no sense in her work that we wouldn't be humans, in a human nature sense. Even if, I've posed this question before and I don't know the answer to it. I mean, at what point when we become fully artificial and cloned and customized, would she actually maybe think we're no longer humans? I have no idea. But I mean, most of us are, I can speak for myself. I'm quite artificial. I have lots of artificial things inside of me at this point. Thank God. And, I'm still pretty human as far as I know. But, is there a tipping point? I don't know. So, I don't know the article you're talking about 100%, but I think, I think there's certainly an argument to be made about Arendt deeply caring about our earthliness and the way in which we are earthly beings, and yet understanding that that's largely an accident of our being born on earth, and that we may in the near future have the capacity to undo that tie. And that's going to have deep consequences, some of which might be good and some of which might be bad, but we should think about it before we do it. So I think you can make a conservationist argument around Arendt saying, we should think what we're doing, and we don't want to tie ourselves. We don't want to cut our tie to the earth completely. I think that's a completely strong Arendtian view. But it's not the only one. Is that, I hope, I don't know this article, so I think I'm trying to respond to what you said. So I hope that gets it.
Yeah, it's Angela last. I can send it to you later. Yeah, but I think your point is interesting, that the condition is always changing, so we have to be open to that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Angie. Now we'll go back to Robert. Robert McKay. I'm just going to skip around a little bit, but I'll get to you all. Robert, are you there?
There. I think I'm audible now.
Yep.
I'd like your help in understanding a sentence from the first section of the chapter.
Yep.
On page 9, at the beginning of the second paragraph. The human condition comprehends more than the conditions under which life has been given to man.
Yep.
Those are the three we're talking about.
Yep.
Men are conditioned beings because everything they come into contact with turns immediately into a condition of their existence.
Mm-hmm.
I'll stop there, although I got some suggestions.
Okay, no, that's great. And this is what we've just been talking about with Ingi. So it's good to back up and make sure we all understand it. The human condition comprehends more than the conditions under which life has been given to man, right? Which refers back to the first sentence of the chapter. The second sentence of the chapter. The fundamental conditions correspond to one of the basic conditions under which life on earth has been given to man. Well, what are the conditions under which life has been given to man? They're the conditions, for the first men, humans, they were the conditions of pure, unadulterated fate and nature, or if you're religious, God-given nature. But for all future men after Adam and Eve, the conditions, the human condition comprehends more than simply the original ones, the natural ones. Men are also conditioned by things which they make and which they come into contact, which which they have made, and that therefore condition their existence too. So, states, homes, pens, computers, all of these things now condition us as human beings. So this is the distinction she's making between human nature and the human condition, which is that the human condition is not some sort of stable natural thing, or nature or essence. It's going to be different for each humanity in every place and time based on the world that they're born into. And it's not going to ever be simply sort of these only sort of a kind of natural, unartificial, fated or God-given world. That's the crux of these sentences, Robert. Is that clear or not?
I think so.
Okay.
Could I ask another question?
If it's short, yeah.
It's not going to be short, so I'll let other people go.
I'm sorry, I just have a lot of people, but
Sure.
Is it a follow-up or is it another question?
No, it's the follow-up.
Just quickly ask it and I'll see what I can do with it. Try and ask it briefly though.
It's about the distinction between the human condition and human nature. Is it possible that one of the reasons why she ducks out on the question of human nature is because she thinks there isn't an answer to it?
Yeah.
As she says on page 10, trying to answer it would be like jumping over our own shadow.
Yep. I think that's exactly why she doesn't answer it. She thinks that the question of human nature or essence is not a question that we humans can answer.
Very existentialist.
Yeah, and you know, she'll base it in Augustine, right, who says that only God can answer that question.
Right.
But you know, if you want to look at her own history, I mean, it's certainly an answer that, I mean, her first teacher, Martin Heidegger, calls man Dasein, right? Being there. And, you know, what Dasein is has confounded people since he wrote that 80, 100, almost 100 years ago. You know, I think she comes out of a tradition of thought, a phenomenological existentialist, whatever you want to call it, tradition of thought that doesn't think we can have an essence of what man is that we can know in that sense. David. David Bell, you there?
I'll unmute myself. Thanks. I think a word that's going through my mind is the word alienation. So alienation is the opposite term to realization of some aspects of our human condition. So what I was thinking was presumably, I don't know, you can help me, but presumably we tend to separate words like thinking and action. And the extreme of that is the contemplative, which I agree, the contemplating of the eternal does seem to me something like the idea of the death drive. But if we can think of thinking as thinking sort of actingly, and acting as acting thinkingly, so that they're not alienated from each other completely, although they can be temporarily separated. So that in the same way that we can be, so to speak, out of the world, but we can't be out of the world unless it's a social world for us to be out of. And similarly, we can be out of ourselves and in the world as long as there is a self for us to be, again, out of. So in that sense, one is a bit, I know it's a bit garbled with this, but if we think that it's also about what are the conditions that are needed for us to realize as far as possible a non-alienated humanity. And it made me think of an early piece of Marx from the German Ideology, where he talks about a very romantic idea about, so to speak, man being able to labor in the morning through fishing, make things in the afternoon, and in the evening use his mind to criticize, but to do all those things without being a hunter or a fisherman or a critic, which alienates him from the other activities. So I just thought that might be something about perhaps a rather romantic view, but then one could ask what kind of conditions could bring the possibility of overcoming the alienation in which we live. And then that becomes a big political question. Can it be achieved, for example, under our present capitalist world?
Yeah, a great question, David. Arendt is going to talk about that quote from the German Ideology in the last section of the chapter on labor. So we have that to look forward to. And she's going to disagree with it or say that it doesn't apply, but we'll get there. You know, I think you've asked a very thoughtful question, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do it justice off the top of my head here. But on the first part of it, you began by opposing alienation and realization, you know, I immediately wondered whether that was the correct. I mean, I was the Arendtian opposition. I don't think it is. I think for Arendt, I'm trying to, you know, so I asked myself, what's the opposite? You know, this whole book in many ways is about alienation, earth alienation and world alienation. And I keep asking myself, what's the opposite of alienation for Arendt. And I'm not sure I have an answer to that, but first came to me was being at home. Another way of thinking that is meaningfulness or purposefulness. You know, the alienation for her is a feeling of that the world doesn't make sense, that the earth is not satisfying us, that the world is not satisfying us, and thus we need to escape it. Fulfillment, I don't know. You know, it's an interesting question. You know, she writes a lot about world alienation and earth alienation. I think something like meaningfulness or home, being at home, in some sense is the opposite of that for her, but I haven't ever conceived the question that way. So it's a great question. It's caught me without a complete know what to say. So I appreciate it for that. On the thinking versus action, I mean, all I'd say is I think there I fully agree with you. I mean, it's not a strict opposition at all. I mean, you know, Arendt will end the book with a quote from one of the Catos, I believe, which is that I'm never, you know, more alone than when I'm, oh man, I have to remind myself what it is. Never is he more active than when he does nothing. Never is he less alone than when he's by himself. But you know, for her, thinking is always has the potential to be active, and action done well should be thoughtful. Her worry, of course, is that usually they're done separately. You know, I mean, I think you know, certainly a model of a thinker who's not active for her is someone like Martin Heidegger. And someone who acts without thinking is someone like maybe Adolf Eichmann. You know, so she certainly sees extremes on these, but I think so much of her work is an attempt to remind us that politics, the action of politics, needs thoughtfulness, not just action. And that's something she says over and over again in her writing. So good questions. And on the question of alienation, which I think is a really important question, let's keep coming back to it because it's going to be a theme throughout this book. And if I can, at the end of this book, have a better sense of what the opposite of alienation is, I'll thank you and be very happy. All right.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. I forget the name here. Vigdis?
Yes, that's okay.
Yeah.
That's about I have one question from the text, but I first have a comment on this if Arendt is striving for immortality. And that's from the interview that Günter Grass had with her in 1964. And if I just can quote in the English translation, and she says, "You ask about the effects of my work on others. If I may wax ironical, that is a masculine question. Men always want to be terribly influential, but I see that as somewhat external. Do I imagine myself being influential? No, I want to understand. And if others understand in the same sense that I have understood, that gives me a sense of satisfaction, like feeling at home."
Yeah.
I think that is such a brilliant.
Yeah, and just to say, I think that's great. Thank you for putting that out there. It goes back to the questions that Ayala and some others, Jeff or Rob, I forget, were asking about, you know, is the will to immortality egoistic? And I think for her, it's not. But go ahead. So go ahead. I appreciate your pointing out that quote.
Yeah, my question is at page 9 and from the first paragraph, and where she says it's about the tree. In vita activa. However, of the three, action has the closest connection with the human condition of natality. The new beginning inherent in birth can make itself felt in the world only because the newcomer possesses the capacity of beginning something anew, that is, of acting. And then comes the sentence that I'm struggling a bit with. In this sense of initiative, an element of action and therefore of natality is inherent in all human activities.
Yeah.
That's a sentence that I'm struggling a bit with.
Well, what she means here is that even in labor and even in work, there's an element of natality. So, you know, again, it's our Arendt does this all the time. She makes these sort of rigid distinctions, and then we sort of spend all time knocking them down. So she'll say that labor, the condition of labor is life, the condition of action is plurality, condition of work is worldliness. But those three conditions are not the only conditions of the human condition, right? She goes ahead and lists a bunch of other conditions, including natality and mortality and others. And so it's not like all labor is just about life and that's it. It doesn't include plurality, and it doesn't include action, and it doesn't include natality. It does. So labor and work, as well as action, are also rooted in natality, she says right above where you started reading. Insofar as they have the task to provide and preserve the world to foresee and reckon with the constant influx of newcomers who are born into the world as strangers. So insofar as, you know, I have to labor and earn a living and provide food, I got to provide it for my kids. And every time I have a new kid or I just got a new cat, I got to work more in order to provide for those new mouths, right? And so labor is not just about life, it's also about natality. And I have to, you know, deal with the fact that in a couple of years, what I do for a living, you know, try and make people think may no longer be desired, and I may need a new job. And so I need to deal with natality in the changing world. And so it's never absolute. You know, all of these things to some degree blur together. However, right, action has the closest connection with natality. Because when I act, I do something that was unexpected. And that's because that's the definition of action. And thus I do something new. So in this sense of initiative, an element of action and therefore of natality is inherent in all human activities. It's in labor, but it's primarily in action. Is that, I think I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I think to a degree. I wrote a paper once on where I looked at everything you do, if you can use that word. And I see them having aspects of those different labor, work, and action. And if you use, I think it's useful to look at what Arendt says about labor has no beginning, no end. It's a process. Work has a clear beginning and clear end, and action with this clear beginning but no end.
Right.
And just to analyze what you do, thinking from this: do this have a beginning? Do this have an end, or is it going into a process?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, and you know, and she makes all these distinctions, and they're all enlightening, I think, in some ways. And yet, you know, what I would eventually say is that any one of them is limiting if we just look at one distinction, right? You know, they're all, I think often it's important to make a distinction in labor, work, and action. But some of the most interesting ways and parts of the book are where she talks about things that are both labor, work, or all three, labor, work, and action. And then, as someone brought up last week, where does thinking fit? And she certainly thinks that thinking is connected with labor at times, and connected with work at times, and connected with action at times. So seeing the, seeing the distinction is important, but also seeing the ways they bleed into each other.
I thought what distinguished work was the product, that it leaves something behind.
What distinguishes work is that it aims to leave something durable behind. Did I say something else? I don't know. Lena.
Roger, this is
Oh.
Alex. I have a question related to the previous. Could
Okay. And you
ask-
are up next after Lena, so I'll let you go, and then we'll bring in Lena.
Sure, great, thank you. Yeah, I'm also really interested in the way the three conditions or the three activities, I guess, relate. And on the one hand, it seems like there are kind of, the so-called supposedly higher condition would rely on the lower in a sense, right? We can't work without being alive. We can't act, without life or without a world. But there's also a line, this is actually very close to the beginning, and it's a sentence, I'll just read it. That seems maybe at odds with that, and I'm just wondering what to make of that. So she writes, action, the only activity that goes on directly between men without the intermediary of things or matter, corresponds to the human condition of plurality, to the fact that men, not man, live on the earth and inhabit the world. And my question is about this without the intermediary of things or matter. It's hard not to hear something about kind of this embodiment there. And I'm wondering how that would fit with, her emphasis on the earth, and also the sense that these conditions must be related in some way, kind of build on one another.
It's a nice question, Alex. Again, she's trying to make strong distinctions to bring something out. And if you take her literally, you're right. It seems like action would have to be in a vacuum somewhere if it were without the intermediary of things or matter. So I think you're right. I don't think she would ever think that there's sort of, maybe we can think of an example of pure action where, I was thinking about speaking, but speaking requires vocal cords. I don't see, if you take it to the extreme, I think it would make action almost meaningless in her world. So it's a good point. What she means by it is that when somebody gets up and speaks, those words, without producing necessarily a book or a monument, those words touch other people. Clearly we need people, we need things, and we need vocal cords and maybe a microphone, but she's saying that action is what happens when a plurality of people are brought together and they encounter a word or a speech or an action that makes them that hits them, moves them, and suggests something new and unthought before. And that's different. And you don't need a monument. You don't need a work. You don't need a durable world. But obviously, action presupposes some world in which you can act. And she says that about the Greek Polis. We'll read that in a couple of weeks. You know, the Greek Polis is a space of appearances, and you could not have action without a space of appearances. So whether that's set up politically or otherwise, you need a world in order to act. So you need works and you need labor. Yeah, I mean, so they're never going to be as separate as one who reads Arendt in that way, saying these sort of things are separate. They're never going to be like that. I hope that does justice to your question.
Yeah, that helps. Thank you. Yeah, I guess it makes me think that maybe there's something in action in this initiating something new. It's maybe a bit of what's called the creation ex nihilo, that something really new does come on the scene.
Yeah, I mean, that's the premise of action, is that it's something new and unexpected, but not in the sense that it has, that you're like, that there's no bodies or things, right? She's just trying to distinguish it from work, which is to put things into the world. In actions, you engage with other people, but obviously you engage with other people within a world of things. And there's no other way to think of it, because we always act in a world.
Thanks,
Lena.
Roger.
Yep, Lena, you're up.
Thank you, Roger. Yeah, I'm finding this very interesting, this space that we've got here, because in a way, since the moment I raised my hand and what I wanted to ask, but then there was all this conversation going on throughout. So of course your thoughts change, influenced by the text, but obviously influenced by what you're saying. So what I really, what's happening in my mind now is that of course, we understand that in a way with these categories, we are always mixing them up. And so we act in certain ways at certain times because we are always in a certain context. And I kept thinking about last week, you mentioned this climate scientist who decided to use this kind of a situation that he was in, which I'm assuming was more of like a public event rather than a climate conference, to kind of use his power or use his knowledge to kind of go for a political stand, I'm assuming, and call for action because of climate emergency. And so I wonder now, in the moment that we are in, which is again climate emergency, we are in this particular moment and we are reading this particular book that was written in 58. We are reading it right now. So what's there in terms of a reassessment of vita contemplativa? Because that one for me, of course, the whole book is about active life, vita activa. So we are about vita contemplativa. Sorry for my pronunciation, but contemplative life. And in a way, I know that even as a child, when you're a teenager, you want this eternity, you want this truth. You are really wondering, like Socrates, like in a sense. And, you want to kind of just think, what's the truth? What's the eternity? You look at the sky, it's very metaphysical, cosmos, and you are trying to attempt to reach this truth, to reach this life. And in a way, I want to just share with you one moment. It's very short. It's when I read about one very famous Croatian actress who, very beautiful, young, who left and started living as a hermit, as a nun in Saint Teresa d'Avila, a kind of an order, nunnery. So in a way, went for a very spiritual life and living as a hermit, somewhere. And she said, life, it just gets better. Now I read this in some interview in a newspaper. I don't even know her name. But that was a moment that really touched me. And in a way, it makes you wonder, how can we really truly live our lives now? And is there a space in this moment now that we have for this vita contemplativa, a kind of a reassessment? Okay, that's what I've been thinking. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Lena. So, no one's going to doubt that there aren't people living contemplative lives in our time, right? Whether it's the actress you're talking about, or as I said, some of my colleagues, they never leave the books or the library. You know, it's there. And you know, I think you can't but think of Nietzsche's hermit running through the forest saying, you know, who hasn't heard that God is dead? You know, there's always going to be the few believers and the few contemplators. I don't think Arendt is denying that at all. What she's saying is that as a publicly meaningful activity, contemplation during Christianity was publicly acknowledged as the highest and most respectful thing you could do. I mean, priests and popes and faithful were people who were revered. I don't think that's the case today. They're seen as eccentrics, hermits running through the forest who haven't yet heard the word that God is dead. And so there certainly are spaces for it, but they're fewer and fewer, and they're smaller and smaller and less effectual, is I think the way I would put it. And, you know, do we need more spaces for it is an interesting question. I think Arendt thinks we do. You know, again, one of the things that's quite controversial in her work, especially among, what shall I call it, left-wing academics today, is her bemoaning the politicization of the universities. She really believed that it was important to have non-political spaces. So, you know, in her essay, Truth and Politics, she says, you know, the whole last part of it, the last section of it, is about the fact that truth doesn't belong in politics. But that doesn't mean there aren't places where truth belongs. And one of them is the university. And she worries throughout her work that as universities become politicized, there's no place really for truth anymore. And a world without truth is a disastrous world for her. Politics is not the place to argue about truth, but we need some place for it. And so similarly, I think I think she believes deeply that we need a space for contemplation. And the space that she thinks is available for contemplation in the modern world is the private realm. So we'll actually start reading about this for next week when we read about the private realm. And it's in the private realm that we have a space free from the social and the political to think. Her worry is that we're losing the private realm, insofar as we increasingly demand of people that they think the way we think they should think, or that they act, and that we have to teach them how to live their lives. And we don't want people who are members of you know, minor cults or religions living differently. We want to create a kind of common opinion. We are increasingly surveilling and normalizing private life. And this is a big part of her worry, because it's in private life where contemplation today has its home. And so, you know, there are still places like the nunnery that your actress, you know, this actress can go to. And I'm not saying there's no place, but it's increasingly circumscribed. Great. I see we've got a lot of hands up and not a whole lot of time, but I'll do what I can. John. John Stern.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
She writes on page 10 that surely only a God can know our essence. She follows up with that, I think, on page 11, where she speaks of the limitations of human, or the conditions of human existence, and that it seems that there's an impermanence. And then she goes on page 19, and she comes back to this idea, I think, which was touched on earlier by Al and Jason, that our life is that man is basically what runs between us, or man and the animals, is similar, if I read that correctly. And I'm not sure, is she speaking in the latter about the condition? And if so, why is that not so depressing? And who makes the choice but the eternal? And why is she not speaking there of a similarity? Why is that not the essence? Are we reading that unless under certain standards that that our existence is at the core animal?
Yeah, so that's a great question, John. I mean, one could read what's on page 19, right, as a statement about the essence of man. So if Aristotle says something along the lines like that man is an animal who has language or rationality, and Kant says that man is a vernünftige Lebewesen, a living being that has reason, one could say Arendt's just giving a different essence to man. Man is someone who must prove themselves to be the best and seek to be immortal. I don't think so. I think one could argue that. I think they'd be wrong. But what she is saying is that at least in certain the human condition as it emerged in the West and has been somewhat impactful throughout, did include this idea of immortality and immortal gods and mortal men, and that part of what it meant to be human in this condition was to strive to be immortal. In the modern world, she's saying, we've largely lost that idea of that conditional striving for immortality. And that one of the impacts of that is that we largely have lost the spring and center for action, because that's what made us act. And we've done that at exactly the time when action, vita activa, has become the center of human life on Earth. And so we now have this situation in which action has become the center of human life on Earth, and the very thing that traditionally gave action its spring and center has been lost, namely this concern with immortality. And so we end up with this kind of dead action, which concerns itself with only the lowest idea or lowest basic condition of human life, which is to be alive. I mean, that's the argument.
I rejected on her previous or her works on totalitarianism, simply because there are unspoken acts of courage, heroism that we will never know of that equal the outstanding that we seem to revere or we know of.
Yeah.
And
Okay. I mean, that's she's not going to deny that there are still outstanding acts of heroism. But she thinks they're ever rarer and ever less impactful. And the very so we'll get there. That's actually we'll be talking about that for next week. So that's going to be the topic of I think are we going to read that for next week? We may. I don't know if we'll get to it for next week. The rise of the social. I don't know if we're reading that for next week or not. I have to look. But on page 41 to 43, she'll be talking about that very question, John. So
thank you.
We'll come back.
I'll look forward to it.
We'll come back to that then.
Thank you so much.
Yep. Robert Persons.
Yeah, hi. Great.
Hi.
Thanks so much.
Yep.
So my question is, what is the relation between Arendt's ideas of the human potential for vita activa in the development of the human artifice and the conception of history and dialectical philosophy? Because it seems to me that Arendt sees the active life as the highest articulation of humanity, and thus it is her task in this book to not only establish her conceptions, but to impact the course of history by arguing for a conscious turn towards active participation in political life against the backdrop of modern society, as it is degrading the human experience into that as simple labor. Arendt's conception of human life as a rectilinear motion in which the works and actions of mortal beings can breach the confines of their biological life and become immortal through remembrance seems to follow a similar path towards greater elaboration and an active becoming of not only the uniqueness of the individual, but the human world on which those deeds are imprinted for further elaborating the human artifice from which successive generations draw their being and understanding. So the question, yeah.
It's an interesting question. If I understand it, you're suggesting that Arendt has a political agenda, which is to, push us to be more active and such. And I have mixed feelings about that. I don't know the answer. Is one. I don't think I think Arendt bemoans in some way this what she's talking about, and yet I don't think. I'm let me put it stronger. I'm pretty darn sure that she's not in favor of going back where we came from. She's not a nostalgic thinker. And she's not saying that, oh my God, we have to go back to the contemplative, or we have to go back to, action. I think she has her own prejudices. But her work, let's take her seriously. It's an attempt to think what we are doing. Mm-hmm. And I think she loves action. And she doesn't really like consumerism. But, And so I think, she's trying to think what we're doing. She puts the values on it. Clearly she would, Lena read to us before, what was the impact you want to have? She goes, no, I just want to write it. I'm trying to understand it. And I take Arendt pretty seriously on that. I think it's an attempt to understand. Now, I think understanding is not a neutral term, because to some degree, as she says in Understanding in Politics, understanding is another word for reconciliation. What is reconciliation? Well, in the Hegelian sense, reconciliation is an attempt to reconcile spirit and matter, the world and the idea. But Arendt's argument throughout her work, and it's going to come up in the human condition as well, is that it may be that we live today in a world that's irreconcilable. And if that's the case, then the Hegelian project fails of reconciliation. And our project is not to reconcile or to, move it in one particular direction, but to think about the irreconcilability of our world, of spirit and matter, of truth, of the idea and action. And I think, and here, this is me, in thinking about it, hold open the possibility of something new starting. What that new is, Arendt doesn't say. I have a book coming out this year, a collection of essays of me and other people, and I wrote an introduction for it, and I just sent it to some friends. And one of them wrote it and said, look, I think you've done a great job with Arendt, and you've convinced me why I don't like Arendt. She just doesn't have answers. She just doesn't have answers. And I wrote back and said, that's right. But she is attempting to understand and reconcile with the irreconcilability of the world, which will open a space for answers to emerge. That's how I see Arendt. I can guarantee you most Arendt scholars don't see her that way. I'm right, they're wrong, but that's okay. But that's how I read her. I'm happy to have people push back on it, but that's, I can only give you what I can give you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah.
Good. Klaus.
Hi, Roger. Thanks. Building on a lot of interesting conversation here. Just quickly on the topic of being right or wrong. I think you're wrong about the way that she presents the I think you took the edge off of her a little bit in terms of like saying, yeah, that all parts of the active life contribute to us being human. I think on page 176, and we'll get there at a later stage, I think she says something that opposes that. I mean, for those interested, and second paragraph on that page, disappearance as distinguished from merely bodily existence rests on initiative, but it is an initiative from which no human can refrain and still be human. That's a side note on being right or wrong, and I would love to have that conversation when we get there. Roger, what I would like to understand now, we're sort of at the beginning of this, I would like to understand what her gripe is with the artificial, because it seems to me that the artificial is actually the precondition for the type of active life that she's talking about. So a lot of too many of the participants to name have brought up very good and central points around, what is the world that we act in, whether or not there are intermediaries for action or not. But it seems to me that the permanence of the world, the objection to the natural world, the objection to Earth, in a sense, that we need that resistance to actually be active in the way that she talks about it, which is with a beginning and an end, so that we transcend or rise above the biological life. That seems to be sort of an essence for this, and yet you're emphasizing that's the way I hear it, at least. Please correct me. That she objects to this artificial artificial world. And I just wonder, like, I see on the one spectrum the Hegelian positive view that, you know, we make things together and we work together to make a world that is more developed, and that is actually how I have sort of understood Arendt. Together, when, you know, we create tools, we create something between us in which the permanence of the world comes to be. And then the other end of that extreme, or the other end of interpreting this development, is the Heideggerian approach as is put forth in The Question of Technology, which is sort of, we're doomed from the beginning, we start to think, and those and we end up in this age of technology where we're you know, finally in a sort of a big brother kind of moment, given into technology. And I would like to just understand, if you follow that approach, where she falls on this, because you seem to suggest, to me at least, that she's more in the Heideggerian end of like some sort of impending doom. And the way that I read it, it's actually we need this permanence, this artificial world to be humans at all.
Yeah, no, I certainly would agree with you. I don't know what I said to lead you to think otherwise. You know, for Arendt, man, whatever we want to call him, is a split being, right? I mean, this is not just for Arendt, this is for many, many thinkers. On the one hand, he's an animal, natural, earthly, given being. And on the other hand, he's thinking, as you put it, technical, artificing being. And as she says on page 2, which we talked about last week, the human artifice of the world separates human existence from all mere animal environment, but life itself is outside this artificial world. And through life, man remains related to all other living organisms. So you see that man is split. On the one hand, he's a living organism who's outside of this artificial world. On the other hand, he's an artificer who remakes the world and the human condition. I think it's pretty clear that Arendt sees man as both those things. What she's saying here, right, is that for X number of years, somewhere around 2000, more or less, just let me use 2000, this man who's split between being an animal and being an artificer has largely lived, you know, in harmony with that split nature. And there's always been a sort of deep desire to you know, move, you know, at times romantic, move back towards nature, and progressive, move towards more artificial, but they've largely been in harmony. What she says is that you know, with the rise of modern science and technology, and then the modern age, we are suddenly have the capacity to potentially actually do what at times we've dreamed of, but never been able to even really think we'd be able to do, which is fully make ourselves artificial. You know, again, this is what we'll read at the end of the book, where you're on a spaceship, and even not only the entire environment, but even every person is, you know, artificially cloned and changed to be useful on the environment. And what she says on page, where is it? Page like 8 or 9. Let me just see. Even then, we'd still be human. You know, she says, you know, on page 10, right? I didn't read this, so I'll look at it, right? The most radical, this is in the 8 lines from the top, the most radical change in the human condition we can imagine would be an emigration of men from the earth to some other planet. Such an event no longer totally impossible, would imply that man would have to live under man-made conditions. So imagine we were living on a planet, even, I think she's thinking of it as we're living on a planet, but we'd have to like put a dome and we live under a completely man-made thing. But imagine actually what there's already people working on. There's whole societies around terraforming that we actually an entire man-made planet, right? Either one. Such an event, no longer totally impossible, would imply that man would have to live under man-made conditions radically different from those the earth offers him. Neither labor nor work nor action nor indeed thought as we know it would then make sense any longer. Yet even these hypothetical wanderers from the earth would still be human. But the only statement we can make regarding their nature is that they still are conditioned beings, even though their condition is now self-made to a considerable extent. So, I mean, you can tell me whether you think that's negative or positive. I mean, I think it's more descriptive. Do I think Hannah Arendt wants to live on a man-made planet? And no, I don't think she does. But she doesn't have to make that choice. She's dead. I don't. I'm not so. Yeah, I mean, I don't. I think I think she sees the human condition one as one in which this balance between our naturalness and our artificiality is part of what it means to be human, as being human has been conditioned for X number of years. I think she thinks that balance is in the process of being fairly radically shifted towards artificiality, which will change thinking, laboring, acting, and working, and will change the human condition, but we'll still be humans. I mean, that's the question you asked, Klaus? I mean, did I answer?
Yeah, but I still think that she sort of outlines that something is at stake, in the prologue, and something is in some sense sort of in danger. I think it's a very interesting outline what you gave there. I would say that I will love to continue to discuss sort of the primacy of science, the role of science in this versus what I think is actually the primacy to me seems to be the alienation part with the unleashing of labor and on the unleashing of nature. I mean, she also describes how natural forces are now unleashed into our technology so that we can power it. And I've always read this book, or the 3 or 4 times I've read it before this. I've read it with the primacy of the unleashing of labor into the social and thereby sort of primarily the world, the disintegration of the world around us. And what I hear from you is another angle to that, is that the science is sort of, is it more in the direction of the artificial? So I really look forward to hearing more about that.
I mean, I think you're right. I think most people, I mean, not this is just, I think, a statement. Most people have read The Human Condition largely along the lines of world alienation. I'm going to read it that way with you, but I'm going to add to it this other element of earth alienation, which I think is central to the book and will largely reappear again, mostly in chapter 6, the long last chapter on the vita activity in the modern age. I've written a fair bit about this. I'm happy to, if you contact me, I'm happy to send you stuff. But yeah, I think as we get there, I hope you'll see that they go together and that they're both important. Just to, on the question of the frame, I just remind you to look back on page 5, right, where she says, in the end of the first paragraph on page 5, what we are confronted with is the prospect of a society of laborers without labor. That is, without the only activity left to them. Surely nothing could be worse. So, this fits with Klaus's reading, right? That this is doom and gloom, right? And I think there's no doubt that Arendt doesn't think this is a very good thing. But then look at the next sentences. To these preoccupations and perplexities, this book does not offer an answer. Such answers are given every day, and they are matters of practical politics, subject to the agreement of many. They can never lie in theoretical considerations or the opinion of one person, as though we dealt here with problems for which only one solution is possible. What I propose in the following is a reconsideration of the human condition from the vantage point of our newest experiences and our most recent fears. This obviously is a matter of thought. and she proposes that we will think what we are doing. She has these fears, right? And she has hopes, and she has new experiences. What I think is amazing about Arendt is she's able to sort of say, look, I have my own personal viewpoints. I have my own prejudices. I have my own politics. But this is a book in which I'm going to try and think it through where we're at. And I think a lot of people might say, oh, she's being disingenuous, right? Maybe that, I don't know if that's where you're coming from, Klaus, or not. I take her seriously on that. And I think the book will stand up to that. But all right. We've gone about 10 minutes over the extended time, and I know there's still some questions. I'm going to have to run. I apologize. But those who had questions, you can email me at arendt.bar.edu or my email, berkowit@bar.edu. No Z, berkowit@bar.edu. With your questions, or I'll try and make sure you get in the queue next time. I'm just looking. It's Elif and Goyer, and I'm not sure who else had a question. Elif and Goyer. I'll try and remember you guys for next week. Thank you all very much. Have a great week and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt.